and then we will hop in. As I was mentioning a second ago, I'm looking over here for comments and live stream on this side. So I'm monitoring the slides that you're seeing on your screen. That's what I'm looking at over here, trying to make sure it's on real time. I'm also monitoring comments. I have my text open. I have my notes on this screen. So all that being said, if you have a comment or if you have a text or something you want to, or a comment, something like you want to bring in, feel free to do either one of those. The difference is, or problem is, I've got about 30-second lag between when I say it and you say it. So, or when I see it. So it's going to be a little bit of a difference. So I'll probably continue to keep talking just so we're sure that we're not lagging behind too much. I don't want to just leave dead open space in the middle of everything. So if you've got a comment, if you've got a question, feel free to bring it up. Just know that it might be a second, and I might keep talking before we talk about it. So I'm just going to keep going. A little bit of a housekeeping on the way that this morning's going to work. This is different from COVID scenarios. When we had COVID, we obviously had a whole prearranged service that was done beforehand. Several people from Hillside helped out with that. We didn't have the ability to do that this time around. So this is going to be kind of a class sermon hybrid. I've got my class, as you can tell up there, Obadiah 3 and 4. So that's where we're going to be at if you want to go ahead and jump into that. But we're also going to be doing the sermon immediately after that. So we're going to do the class, probably because we don't have much audience participation in real time as we would in a church building. That is going to be probably a little bit of a shorter class if you've ever been there, which most of us have been because most of us are from Hillside. You know that there's a lot of give and take. I still want that. So if you have that ability or if you have comments or questions, feel free to bring them in because I want to make sure we address those. Then after the class period, we are going to take a 10-minute break. And at that 10-minute break, there is going to be we're going to take that 10-minute break for the communion. And so the communion slide will be up. There's also going to be a QR code for the contribution, so we can still give online, those of us who do that. If not, I'm sure there are other ways that we can get it in regardless. But that's going to be available, so that'll be a 10-minute break, and then we'll jump back in for the sermon. Probably also about the normal time, although this whole format is still a little weird to me, so we might have a little bit of a shorter service. But anyways, enough chit-chat. Let's get right into it. We're going to start in Obadiah verses 3 through 4. Those of us who have been in this class for the last few weeks, we kind of know what's happening with this class. The whole idea of Obadiah in the home is that when we talk about the minor prophets and we read about them, oftentimes the language is very Old Testament based. It's, judgment, it's prophecy, it's Old Testament names and places and figures. And so the whole idea for this class was to bring the minor prophets, who are talking to real people, by the way. The things that they're addressing are very much to actual humans with actual lives, just like you and I do, and try to move it into a modern day context. The idea is not to change the text at all. That's not what I want to do. What I do want us to do is find relevancy in this. I want us to see what the minor prophets are talking about, find the relevance inside of it for our purposes, because a lot of the minor prophets addressed issues, as we'll discuss this morning, that are very common to a lot of us. The things that we've discussed the last few weeks are things like greed. They're things like, not oppression's too hard of a word, but how you sell out, your fellow Jew and your fellow Israelite. We talked about those from the other minor prophets. Obadiah is a book that is very much judgment oriented, and it was, despite the name of it, it was definitely the last one that I put in this, just because the whole entire book is all about a destruction of Edom. And we'll talk about Edom here in just a second. But literally there's 25 verses in Obadiah, or 21. Literally all of them have to do with judgment against Edom. And that's a very targeted thing. It's very much like Nahum in that way. Jonah is addressed to Assyria, Nineveh specifically, obviously. But then Nahum comes in and just talks about the destruction in general. It's a sequel to it in a lot of senses. And so that's a very targeted book, Nahum is. Obadiah is also a very targeted book. And so the challenge with these is, how do you address or find religious concepts inside a religious book, but that are largely about a secular nation? And I think that's the struggle with this type of stuff. And so feel free to bring up any comments or questions, because we've had great participation through this quarter so far, and I want to make sure that we keep it going as much as possible. But we're going to look at Obadiah verses 3 through 4. Just as kind of a brief intro to this book, because as I mentioned, there is quite a bit of background material that sometimes we don't think about. Obadiah is targeted primarily to the Edomites. And the Edomites probably are pretty well known, I think, to a lot of us. They are the descendants of Esau. They came from Esau, and they were supplanted by Israel. That's all mentioned in Genesis chapter 25, verses 22 through 34. What's fascinating about this section, and it's not super apparent the first time you read it, is this section describes the birth, which is the major incident kind of for our purposes in regards to the supplanting and the theme that's going to be carried throughout Jacob's life. The idea of him being a supplanter is really, really big in his life. But then you have the secondary story in verses 22 through 34 that is about Jacob stealing the birthright from Esau. That is a truncated version. It's almost as if Moses gives it to kind of plant the seed for what's eventually going to be happening 2 chapters later in chapter 27. The entirety of chapter 27 is all about him stealing the birthright. So that's the entirety of that section. And so that's kind of the two concepts there. What's interesting about that relationship is immediately after that, you have the brothers reconciling. This comes on the heels of Jacob going off and doing his own thing. He's married, by this point, 2 different wives, 2 different concubines, 12 children. As you would imagine, somebody who stole the birthright from his brother, he's understandably very nervous, thinks that Esau is probably going to kill him, because Esau in those chapters is not by himself. He has essentially what amounts to an army. If my memory is right on those chapters, there's not really a whole lot of family that is with Edom or with Esau at that point. It's largely military people. It seems like he's almost amassed a city unto himself. So Jacob is very nervous. They meet in Genesis chapter 32 to 33. It's a very emotional scene. There's a lot of weeping. There's a lot of crying. There's a lot of love involved in that. There's also some, I would argue, if you look at that text a little closely, it seems to be still a little bit of malice between those two nations. And so that's existent because when you look at, for instance, Numbers chapter 20, verses 14 through 21, there still is that tension. And you can look in Numbers chapter 20, verses 14 through 21, at a specific instance when Moses is trying to lead the wilderness through a specific section. I think it's up in the wilderness of Zin, which is near Kadesh Barnea, or southern Kadesh, rather. And the Edomites just quite frankly stop them. That gives us 2 things. Number one is it represents the tension between Edom and Israel at that point. That's still very much in existence. But it is also shows the geographical location of Edom. And that's really important when it comes to the nature of why Edom is mad to begin with. They're in the southern section, so they're located directly near where Sodom and Gomorrah is. I don't think that really factors in too much because Sodom predates Jacob and Esau, as you can tell from the text there. But that's the type of people that you're dealing with. And as time goes on throughout history, they're going to continue to be conquered, and they're going to move farther and farther south. They're going to retreat further and further into the mountains. During our sermon this morning, we're going to talk about the nature of self-deception, thinking that you're stronger than you actually are. And Edom absolutely is the poster child for something like that. They believed, as Obadiah talks about, that they were bulletproof. And that has to do specifically with the geographical terrain that's in place in Edom. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. The nations, however, did not reconcile. Jacob and Esau did as individuals. The nations did not. There's an ongoing hostility that would last through the intertestamental period, even into the early time of the Romans. So they're going to hate each other for forever. Then you have the flip-flopping back and forth. They're conquered by David. 2 Samuel 8, verse 14, it's a very quick mention, but that is in the victory after victory after victory section of David's rise to the throne. So conquered by David, 2 Samuel 8, verse 14, and then quickly unravels because by 2 Kings chapter 8, 20 through 22, they then revolt. They are then taken back over by a king after Jehoram, and then they are then recaptured, or then they re-rebel, if you can argue that, and that's essentially when they maintain their own country for a while. This book, Obadiah specifically, is written in that time period around Jehoram. And so there's 2 schools of thought in regards to this. It could either be people that are, the dating for this book could either be early, which is the way that I'm going to take it, 853, that time period around Jehoram. There is also a large subset of the population that believes that this book is written after the exile. I don't personally find that convincing, but you may, and so if that's fine, or if you believe that, we can still be friends. There's nothing wrong with that. But that, I think, changes the nature of Obadiah just a tad, I think, when you're talking about the direct audience. In my opinion, Obadiah is still very much addressing people that are in active conflict with a declining but active Israel and Judah. So I think that's essentially what's happening here. So they rebelled under Jehoram. And then immediately after that, you have them exiled by the Nabateans. They're defeated by the Maccabees. There's no verse references for that. There has to be one mistake in every keynote. There it is. Hopefully that's the only one. They eventually are exiled by the Nabateans, taken over. And then they're defeated once again by the Maccabees. That's that intertestamental period. And so everything that happens in Obadiah essentially predates those two events, in my opinion, because you have a nation that is extremely strong, extremely self-confident, and then the Nabateans come in and just essentially wipe the floor with them. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, the Maccabees, which are the descendants, are Jews in that intertestamental period, but they're known as a specific type of Jews. They're not just every Jew. But then these Jewish warriors, soldiers, come in and destroy what's left of the Edomites. The Maccabees are a family, I guess that's a better word for it. So they're defeated ultimately by the Maccabeans, and then they're kind of fade from history after that. The frustrating thing, I think, when you look at this, and this is what makes Obadiah, and especially study the Edomites, difficult, is that it seems almost like the deck is stacked against them from the beginning. Look at Malachi chapter 1. And you're going to hear some click-clacking. That just comes from my keyboard that's literally right next to my microphone. And so I'll try to keep that to a minimum. Malachi chapter 1, though, as you can tell, the deck almost just seems stacked against them from the beginning. Look at Malachi chapter 1, verse 1. The oracle of the word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi, saying, I have loved you, says the Lord. But you say, how have you loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord, and yet I have loved Jacob. Verse 2 starts this discussion within Malachi of, I love you, you know I love you, and this is how you know I love you. And it's because my relationship with both of the brothers is different. I love Jacob, he says in verse 2, which is very action-oriented. I'm demonstrating that through my interactions with Jacob. And yet I have hated Esau. And so he says that in verse 3. Now, that's given lots of people lots of issues, because it seems like Obadiah, Numbers 20, 2 Samuel 18, all these things that we just talked about, they all just seem to be a continuation of the discrimination, if you will, against the Edomites. That's not a warranted concept. Numbers 20 discusses how they position themselves as enemies against Israel. So those cards are already laid. The problem that people have with it is, from a Calvinistic standpoint, people will say, well, God hated Esau from the beginning. That's not the case at all. If God had hated Esau, and this is where people can jump in if they want to, or you can text me if you would like. If God had hated Esau, then Esau wouldn't have developed into the nation that they were. The point that he's getting at here in verses 2 and 3 is from a spiritual basis. I have blessed you in ways, he says, that I have not blessed Esau. Verse 3 Malachi comes after Obadiah. He says, but I've hated Esau. I've made his mountains a desolation, appointed his inheritance for the jackals of the wilderness. Though Edom says, we have been beaten down, but we will return and build up the ruins, thus says the Lord of hosts. They may build, Edomites may build, but I'm going to tear down, and men will call them the wicked territory, and the people toward whom the Lord is indignant forever. Your eyes, verse 5, will see this, and you will say, the Lord be magnified beyond the border of Israel. Malachi 1 jumps in on this conflict that's between the Israelites and the Edomites, and says that the Edomites are going to be destroyed even more than they already have been. But, as he points out in verse 4, they're going to build, I'm going to tear down. They think, according to verse 4, we're bulletproof. I'm going to show them how unbulletproof they actually are. And so in verse 5, he's talking to the nation of Israel. Your eyes are going to see this, and you're going to say the Lord be magnified beyond the border of Israel. Because not only does God work inside of Israel, but also extends outside of the border. He knows no boundaries. He knows no limits to his power. But also it's very clear who God is actually going to help. And it's not the Edomites. So that's why Obadiah is such a powerful chapter, is because just like Habakkuk kind of does, just like Nahum does kind of in totality, and just like sections of Isaiah and Ezekiel do, he's describing the outright rejection of God's enemies. And as an Israelite, you can't want any more than that. So go into Obadiah now. I'll give you a second to find that, because Obadiah is a tiny little book, and it is not super accessible. So go into Obadiah. If you don't want to look there, if you don't want to look in that, I've got it up on the board just we have been all quarter. These are the two verses I want to focus on. Obadiah verses 3 through 4. He says, and the arrogance, or he's talking to the Edomites once again, the arrogance of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock, in the loftiness of your dwelling place, who say in your hearts, and this is once again that arrogance, who will bring me down to earth? Though you build high like the eagle, though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down. When you look at this section, there's a lot of there's not as much nuance as there is in the other minor prophets. Obadiah is very blatant, and the structure of Obadiah lends itself to I'm going to defeat you. This is the problem that you have. This is what it's going to look like, and then there's going to be hope for Israel at the end. That's generally the structure for most of the minor prophets. The key phrase, though, in this entire section is within this first section, where he says, the arrogance of your heart has deceived you. As we're thinking about these concepts in the minor prophets for our world today, think about how this type of self-deception usually arises. There's a reason why the sermon for today is placed with this chapter, is because I want to talk about this idea of self-deception kind of entirely. How does some type of self-deception arise? And you can feel free to bring it up. You can text in the comments. You can text me privately, and if it's okay with you, I'll read it out loud. How does self-deception develop? All of us can get to a point where we are more confident in our abilities than we probably should be. All of us can get to a point where we believe that we're bulletproof when we really aren't. And I would imagine some of the comments, if we were standing in class today, I would imagine most of the comments would come to along with pride. And you're right about that, but that's kind of a circular answer. How does pride develop? How does the arrogance of your heart then deceive you? I think a lot of it comes in regards to comfort. If you look in Deuteronomy, for instance, Moses says, when you get into the land, you're going to get fat and happy and forget how all of this originated to begin with. That's kind of indicative of, I think, where the Edomites are. If you've existed for a period of time and you really haven't had any issues, then the problem is you begin to think that you'll never have any issues. Think about where we're at in the United States of America. Very strong country. We've never had, and somebody can correct me, I know somebody would, we've never had a foreign invasion on our soil, unless you count the British in 1812. And so we tend to think, because we've existed for so long, that nothing can happen to us. And yet we forget that the Edomites existed for about 500 or 600 years before they were annihilated. And even once they were destroyed initially, it was still another 300 or 400 years before they dissipated entirely. If you think about it from a family perspective, you may be going through a season of your life where things are just firing on all cylinders for you. You've got your job cooking, you've got your school is just rocking along, straight A's, your stock portfolio is just taking off. And so you think to yourself, as the Edomites did, there's nothing in this world that can bring me down. I know nobody intentionally thinks that. And that's part of what I wanted to deal with these minor prophets is, I don't know of any one person. I guess I can think of a couple. Nobody here that I know of, but no person would ever say that nothing bad will ever happen to them. But we sometimes act like that. And that's what Obadiah is developing, is the unconscious viewpoint that we sometimes develop that nothing bad can ever happen to us. When in reality, you and I both know, like with COVID or stock market or whatever else, or with Russia or whatever it may be, that we are only one bad day, one bad hour away, sometimes, from our entire life going upside down. You may think to yourself that everything is great, and then a family member gets sick. So what he's addressing in this passage is the deception of our own self-pride, and how sometimes that kind of creeps in. Think about this from Obadiah's perspective. These people are not, there's nothing unwarranted about their position. The way that this develops from a Obadiah or from an Edomite perspective is the loftiness of your dwelling place. And there's several mentions inside of Obadiah that talk about you who live in the cleft of the rock, you who do this, you who kind of create, you have these homes that are in very deep, dark areas. These secure situations develop that self-deception. And so the loftiness of your dwelling place creates the arrogance and the deception of your heart, which then creates this perception or this statement that we then develop, which is, who's going to bring me down to earth? And so it's a very 1, 2, 3 type of situation. We have whatever physical situation, emotional situation we're in, that then develops our state of mind, which then develops the posture that we take to other people. So from a 1, 2, 3 perspective, essentially what you're looking at here is the situation that creates the deception that encouraged the arrogance that destroyed them. And I don't think this is I don't know how to say this. This just sounds so bougie. I don't know how to say this in a non-causal way. Their situation that then deceives themselves then puts them in situations where they are destroyed. Think about it. As Moses is going through Numbers chapter 20, going through Edom's territory, he could he said to them, look, we're going to go through Numbers chapter 20. We're going to go through your areas, and if we eat or drink anything, we'll pay you back fourfold. Well, Edom said, you're not going to do that. And if you do that, we're going to come out and destroy you. Well, what are they going to do? They're operating from a position of strength. They think that they can take on the 2+ million people that are walking through their territory. The only reason you can do that is because if you think you can back up that claim. The reason they existed for so long against other places is because they believed that they operated from a position of military strength, economic strength. Well, that arrogance led them to say and do things to people that they would not have said and would not have done if they didn't have that arrogance. So their arrogance created that situation. They created their own downfall. And that's really what I think the issue is here in Obadiah. Yes, it's arrogance. Yes, it's pride. But it's how that arrogance and pride creates and says and acts ways that you wouldn't have if you were humble. And maybe if you were humble, you would have more friends. Maybe if you were nice to other people, you wouldn't have the Romans knocking down your doorstep. Maybe if you had made friends with the Israelites when they walked through your territory to begin with, we wouldn't be in this situation. And yet you've created enemies that you didn't have to create. Obadiah is big on this. Getting back to this concept, and feel free to bring up comments or questions. I see Sandra talking in the Facebook comments, and she's exactly right. Pride, people that think they don't need God. I've had a couple of people text me comments. I won't read it unless you tell me that I can. I don't want to betray anybody's trust. The nation of Edom has two very good reasons why they have this posture. Number one, and I feel like a broken record when I talk about trade routes, because trade routes are everywhere in ancient world and they're very fluid. There are some developed areas, some developed trade routes, obviously, that point from major city to major city that have more wealth traveling down those roads than they would otherwise. You're not going to take $1 million in gold through the channels of the mountains where you can be taken. You're going to go along what essentially is a caravan route. And so most of the wealth in the trade route, that as it extends north into Israel, west into Egypt, that comes from the southern Sinai Peninsula and the eastern areas of Arabia, is going to develop along this ridge. And if you were in our Bible geography class, you know there's a good reason for that. That interior of the Sinai Peninsula is desert. There is nothing there. So you're going to hug that coastline as a trade route because it has resources, has water. It allows you to travel. Well, the number one stop when you split and go one of two different directions or three different directions is going to be the nation of Edom. So a lot of wealth that comes through that area, a lot of Edomites that are kind of skimming off the top, and Edomites that are changing money and buying and selling. There's a huge concentration of wealth inside Edom, which is part of why they position themselves and say, well, we don't really need anything else. You also have, if you are eagle-eyed, you can see on that map the real issue of their strength, which is the city of Petra. And in case you're wondering, yes, Petra was discovered by Indiana Jones in 1984. I get that. But before that, Petra was a city known previously as the city of Bozrah. And this is mentioned in the Old Testament. Look in Jeremiah chapter 49. Petra is descended from Bozrah. And Bozrah originally is the capital of the city of Edom. And so this obviously wasn't developed by the Edomites. When you're looking at the picture and see the fancy columns, that wasn't the Edomites that did that. But this is where they lived, and this was their capital city. And if you've ever done any research on Petra, you know that it takes quite a while to get back in there because there are caverns, and there are holes, and there are pathways through mountains to get there. So they have not only the geographic isolation, but if you're going to attack that, you've got to go through very narrow channels to get there. Well, those are relatively defendable by a smaller population than if you were out in the open. So the Edomites have quite a bit of strategic advantage. Jeremiah chapter 49, starting in verse 7, addresses Bozrah. Concerning Edom, Jeremiah 49, verse 7, thus says the Lord of hosts, is there no longer any wisdom in Teman? That would be the third leg that they could stand on, wisdom. Edom was known for their wisdom. It's mentioned in other passages as well. But he asks, is there no longer any wisdom in Teman? Has good counsel been lost to the prudent? Has their wisdom decayed? Is all this just gone? Flee away, turn back, dwell in the depths, O inhabitants of Dedan, which is another Edomite city. For I will bring the disaster of Esau upon him at the time I punish him. If grape gatherers come to you, would they not leave gleanings? If thieves came by night, they would destroy only until they had enough. In other words, it's not like people are going to stop. You know, if you have gleanings, you're coming for gleanings, you're going to you're going to take a little bit and leave the rest of it. That's not how this destruction is going to work. Verse 10, I have stripped Esau bare, like locusts. I have uncovered his hiding places that he will not be able to conceal himself. His offspring has been destroyed along with his relatives, his neighbor, and he is no more. Leave your orphans behind. I'm going to keep them alive, and let your widows trust in me. For thus says the Lord, behold, those who were not sentenced to drink the cup will certainly drink it. And are you the one who will be completely acquitted? You're not going to be acquitted, but you will certainly drink it. Verse 13, for I've sworn by myself, declares the Lord, that Bozrah, Petra, which eventually became Petra, will become an object of horror, a reproach, a ruin, and curse, and all of its cities will become perpetual ruins. I'm going to annihilate you. Your wisdom's going to be gone. Bozrah, which was originally seen as this impenetrable fortress, that's going to become an object of horror. The language here is very similar to what God would talk about with Israel. People are going to walk by and they're going to hiss at you. There's nothing there that you can lean on for safety. I'm going to annihilate everything about that. If you look in Isaiah 69, this is another passage that talks about this exact same thing. There is no Isaiah 69. I said that in the brains. That's not it. Here it is. Isaiah 63. Isaiah 63, not Isaiah 69. If you find Isaiah 69, let someone know, because there'll be people that will want to study that. Isaiah 63, starting verse 1. Who is this who comes from Edom with garments of glowing colors from Bozrah? The one who is majestic in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength. It is I who speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Why is your apparel red, and your garments like the one who treads the winepress? I have trodden the wine trough alone, and from the peoples there was no man with me. I also trod them in my anger and trampled them in my wrath. Their life bread is sprinkled on my garments, and I stained all my raiment. For the day of vengeance was in my heart, for my year of redemption has come. I looked, and there was no one to help, and I was astonished, and there was no one to uphold. So my own arm brought salvation to me, my wrath upheld me. I trod down the peoples in my anger, I made them drunk in my wrath, and I poured out their lifeblood on the earth. The whole point of this section here in Isaiah 63 is the self-perception of strength. The idea that we are coming out to save and we're so strong. And God comes back and says, I don't know why you're acting like this, because number one, you've never helped anybody except the enemies of Israel. And number two, you can't stand up to anybody. I'm going to destroy you. So all of this is in this section about self-deception. All of this has to do with strength. All of this comes back to this idea of you think you're something when you're actually not. And that's really kind of the idea that we're getting at here. Jim says self-deception is the example of the Jews in Romans chapter 2, verses 17 through 24. That's exactly right. I mean, we talked about this last week with the circumcision of the heart. It's the same type of idea. The belief that I don't need really God, or I don't really need salvation because of my lineage. The Jews looked at the Gentiles and thought, well, they need salvation. Obviously, I don't because of who I am. God's going to spend quite a bit of time unpacking that concept throughout the book of Romans. That's a great comment. When you look back at Obadiah, there's one verse in particular that he mentions. He says, on the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth, foreigners entered his gate and cast lots for Jerusalem, you too were as one of them. That's arguably the biggest charge in Obadiah that he makes towards Edom, is the idea that not only did you not help my people, not only did you not help the Jews, but you also stood by and essentially assisted them. Psalm 137 verse 7 talks about this. Ezekiel 25 verses 12 through 14, chapter 35 verse 5. They all address this concept of the Edomites standing by and actively participating in the destruction of Judah and the destruction of Israel. And of course, that comes back to the major question, which is, why does Edom help Babylon to begin with? Well, flip it on its head. We asked this several weeks ago in our Wednesday night class about Josiah. Why does Josiah intervene to help out Assyria and Egypt against Babylon? Well, it goes back to the map that these guys are in. These guys, if you look at where Edom and Judah is located, they're at the corridor of a very strategic section. And so either you become an assistant, you become Switzerland to all these people, or, which they probably wouldn't let you do, or you aid what you believe is an emerging superpower. Edom, apparently, in Ezekiel 25, verse 12 through 14, saw Babylon as the emerging superpower, threw his hat in with them, at the expense of their neighbor and their brother, which is Jacob and Esau, their brother Judah. That's not going to sit well with God. And it's not going to sit well with the Jews. And they're going to be looking at these people who hurt them as an opportunity as enemies. They're going to look at them as enemies. And so he says here in this passage, these people that not only destroyed Judah, these people that cast lots for the wealth, these people that ransacked Jerusalem, even if you didn't do it, which you did at times, you still didn't stop it. Jim brought up Romans chapter 1, or Romans chapter 2, at the end of Romans 1 and verse 32, there's a passage where after he describes all these things that you do, all these sinful things that people do, he then says, not only those who do the same, but also those who approve of them. There's a note in this, in Obadiah, that I think is worth talking about. That the arrogance of our heart and that self-deception that it creates doesn't just manifest in the way that we treat people. I'm going and doing this to you. It sometimes comes in the way that we stand aloof from them. Rich man and Lazarus, and I can hear it now. There are so many people at Hillside screaming at me that it's not a parable. That's fine. But the rich man and Lazarus, the man that stepped over Lazarus every single day, the man that it completely ignored Lazarus, and then only after he's dead does he even acknowledge him, which he knows his name, but he just never even acknowledges him. And so the idea there is, even if you didn't contribute to the downfall of your brother, you still didn't help the situation. And that's, I think, the frustrating aspect of this, is that even if somebody would say, well, we weren't guilty of all this. Well, you were, because you didn't do anything to stop it. And that's what Obadiah teaches. Sandra brings up a great comment. I actually meant to make this earlier, but I'm glad that she did, because I forgot about it. But she says, I don't think they ever forgot that Jacob cheated Esau for the birthright. I think that's exactly right. Why would Edom help Babylon? Well, probably because they're helping the emerging superpower. But I think also a part of this is they never forgot that 800 years earlier, 500 years earlier, Jacob stole that birthright from Esau. And so just as we're going to talk about this morning with Korah's rebellion for a little bit, there's the belief that what was taken from them was stolen, and we're going to get it back. So they could very easily rationalize that to God. Well, we're just going after what's ours. You're not, though. You're not. You're stealing something that was never yours, that your ancestor gave up. So I'm glad that she brought that comment up, because I think that's really, really important. What's the issue with this whole thing? Well, essentially the issue boils down to this. Believing themselves invincible. This was the hardest one for me to put out of the entire quarter. Believing themselves invincible and seeing an opportunity to hurt a brother, they acted as if there were no consequences whatsoever. That's really what it boils down to. They didn't think that there was anything possible that could hurt them. And so because of that, they then saw an opportunity to exact revenge, to better their station, whatever the situation is, but it came at the expense of somebody they were close to. And then they just acted as if there were no consequences whatsoever to their actions, which is 1,000% wrong. Now, let's ask ourselves this question, keeping this idea of Obadiah in the home. How do these minor prophets apply to us in today's world? How could he be speaking to us? Well, I think you can probably come up with several of these yourself, but I want to bring up some that I thought of. And I think all of these, as I mentioned last week, the week before, these are all things I've probably said. I know I've said some of them. Probably have said the other ones in my own life. Number one, well, there's nothing they can do about it. I'm trying to use my best Southern accent. Well, there's nothing they can do about it. That was, I don't know, maybe that was terrible. I couldn't help myself. There's nothing they can do about it. How about this one? We're too big to fail. How many companies have you heard like this? Enron is the best example that I can possibly think of. We're too big to fail. Mistakes don't really affect us like they affect a smaller company. They'll never know it was me. Yeah, well, God will. It doesn't matter what happens. They'll never know it was me. Yeah, they will. I don't know anyone anything. I'm not sure about that. Something like that won't affect me. That's kind of the same idea of we're too big to fail. Something like that's not going to touch me. I'm too distant. I'm too isolated. I'm too resourceful. It's not going to affect me. I'll be gone before anybody knows it. That's definitely an option that some people would say. I'll be gone before anyone can tell. This is one of my favorites. I'm too indispensable. In other words, I can do whatever I want to. I'm not going to get fired. I'm not going to be disfellowshipped because I'm too indispensable. And I have seen this in some smaller churches. And I've even seen this in bigger churches. Somebody contributes a substantial amount of money to the contribution, and they think because of that it gives them license to act or say certain things. The same thing can be said for people in leadership. The same thing can be said for people that are preachers. I know of people like that. I'm too indispensable to this group. Therefore, I can say, do, act, behave however I want to. Because after all, if they get rid of me, then they're worse off anyways. And so I can act however I want to. No, you're not. No one's indispensable. That's the number one lesson everybody should learn, including myself. I've survived worse than this. You say that. You don't really know how bad it's going to be. I haven't been caught yet. Yeah, everybody says that before they're actually caught. This is, I don't know if anybody says this phrase anymore. I think probably we do. It's a dog-eat-dog world after all. I mean, is it? Doesn't have to be. So it's a dog-eat-dog world after all. I mean, we don't have to make it that way. So the question then, after all of this, acknowledging the self-deception that led to pride, that led to the actions, the question then is, how do we fix this? If deception is by its nature deceptive, but if we can't always tell it, how do we prevent this or solve it once it happened? Well, fortunately, this isn't an isolated incident. Think about Revelation chapter 3, verse 18, the church to Laodicea. These people that thought they were rich, that thought they could see, that thought they were spotless. And Jesus tells them in Revelation chapter 3, verse 18, buy for me gold refined by fire, white clothes, eye salve for your eyes. In other words, you need to be looking for things. The problem with self-deception comes when we begin to look too much inward and say, well, I'm too big to fail. I'm too strong. I'm too this or that. The reality is that we need to extend outward to ourselves. And we need to say, what does God want? What is the goal that I should be looking for? What is my honest condition? What is my honest situation? When we look outwards instead of inwards, things change a little bit. And I think that's why Revelation 3 just positions itself so well against us. Sandra says, might say, well, God is against me. What have I got to lose? Yeah, that's certainly, well, I don't know if that's Edom's position, but it's certainly Judah's position. You flip this around, you can make the argument to Judah that you guys think because they have the temple that nothing bad can happen to you. I mean, God can show you real quick what your stance is. I see now what you're saying, though. God is against me. What have I got to lose? If I'm going to lose everything, might as well go down swinging. Yeah, that's a very fatalistic interpretation, but 100% accurate in the way that we look at it. Well, doesn't matter. What else have I got to lose? Unfortunately, that is the way that some people think. All right, that's the class that we were going to do this morning. We would normally have quite a bit of input. We had several people that talked in, so I appreciate everybody that commented. Like I said, you can also text. Like I said at the beginning, what we're going to do now is we are going to take a brief 10-minute break. And so right now it is, by my watch, 10:10? Yeah, 10:10. So at 10:20, we're going to come back. And we are going to start the sermon section of it. I'll do it exactly like the way I did it now. I would rather do Bible classes than do sermons any day of the week, just because I love the give and take in classes. So I'm going to treat the sermon like a class. We're going to talk through it the exact same way that we talked through this. If you have thoughts, comments, questions, feel free to bring them up. I'm going to put up a communion slide. These 10 minutes are for you to take communion with your family, to read, to meditate on Scripture, meditate on Jesus' sacrifice. There will also be on that slide a QR code for our members who would like to give. If you're watching this from another state, which I know we have people watching this from other places, you are not required to give. That's not the point of this, is to get you to give to our church. The point of this is an opportunity for members here to give to the congregation, to the work at Hillside. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. I'll put that slide up, and then I'll see you back here for our sermon at 10:20.